Okay. I'm Andy Revkin. You probably know me most through all of my work at the New York Times the last 21 years in different capacities. I'm here at ProPublica down in Lower Manhattan, where I'm starting to hang out. I start here officially December 5th. And it's an amazing place, a team. It's kind of like a special ops team version of journalism, focusing on the toughest stuff, the hardest thing to do, the thing that's fading most in most newsrooms, unfortunately, deep digging and the sustained investigative approach to stories. And it's really exciting to be here to dig in on that capacity. After the last 6 years, .earth, my blog, has been a great way to explore the general question of how do we head forward roughly 9 billion people without screwing up too much. But now it's time to dig in on climate again, which I've been writing about since the 1980s. Here, I'm going to, again, do in-depth reporting. It'll take me from Washington right now, of course, for sure, with the emerging Trump administration, around the world as needed to be sure that in the public interest, the public knows what's really going on, what really will make sense, what isn't going to change the world that some might sound like it's changing the world, kind of a reality check on some of these assertions up there. I'm here today with Adriana Gallardo and Terry Parris Jr., who are part of the engagement team, an expanding team here at ProPublica, which is Revkin. And we're going to be online here on my Facebook page. After request, I'm excited to, I've been doing trade journalism blog started when I was a news reporter, but I just found it on a story as complex as sustainability and climate change, it felt easier to, richer, and a better learning experience for me to have an interactive relationship with the people who are paying attention to what I do. So there are questions coming in, I believe, and we'll start with those and then continue. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Andy. Our first question here at ProPublica for you, we're just wondering what's it like to leave the New York Times after 20+ years?
Well, it's weird. The Times is kind of like a place where when you get there, you do feel like it's the end of the line. But as we all know, journalism's changing, even at the New York Times. I took a buyout 6 years ago, and the staff, and I kept doing .earth, which moved to the opinion side. But .earth is, I've also been mainly teaching. I teaching at Pace University. And juggling those various obligations got hard, and I was really excited when I saw in August that ProPublica was creating a position, a reporter position, just to focus on climate and energy, because, in the background, it's one of these classic issues that's simmering in the background, but doesn't get enough attention because of its shape. It's slow-moving, it's full of implicit uncertainty, along with the things that we know really well, and just the idea that there's this multi-year commitment by an organization like ProPublica and the donors who help support it to dig in deeper was something I couldn't turn down.
Great. Our first question is from Chris Shenton. His question is, systemically, what areas of environmental policy will be easiest for Trump to change, influence, or dismantle?
The most problematic areas may be things other than climate change. As I said a minute ago, climate change, the scope of the drivers of what's going on with the climate system and how we're nudging it with human-generated emissions are not really easily within the control of a president. I wrote a piece on .earth a week or so ago that noted that even the gains on emissions under President Obama so far were mostly a function of markets and emerging technologies that allowed more natural gas to be produced, which made it way cheaper than coal. And when you switch from coal to natural gas, that comes with a lot less pollution. So you could say that even on the upside, Obama he hasn't had that much influence. Most of what's enshrined in the Paris Agreement, the climate treaty, is things countries feel they were going to be able to do anyway. It's not like treaties. There used to be this idea that a treaty on an environmental issue kind of is the thing that shapes countries' behaviors. But on an issue as big as climate, where countries' economies are still so linked to energy, it works the other way. They'll only sign a treaty if it accommodates their energy interests. And so it's not like moving to Trump will immediately, even though he is planning to disconnect us in some way or other from that treaty process. And that will slow things down diplomatically, but will it change emissions trajectories? Maybe. It's hard to even know what business as usual is anymore because there's so much. The other thing that's not really under presidential control is the gains in the solar, wind, energy arenas are not going to go away. And the competitiveness of those technologies is going to remain. There are some subsidies that I think it's unlikely that he'll play with those because he even said it wasn't really it wasn't what we paid attention to in the press, but he answered some questions from the sciencedebate.org organization, and one of them was that renewable energy and moving away from fossil fuels is probably a good thing. He kind of used the word perhaps. When was the last time Trump used a word like perhaps? I don't think he wrote it, but there are inklings of that he might sustain renewables, at least not undercut them too badly. So that's it's a mixed bag. The things he can do, if he puts Sarah Palin in at Interior Secretary, that's troubling. There are things that can be done with land policy pretty quickly that can change things. Although even there too, you see markets will determine. Like there's a lot of coal in federal land, but the rate at which it's being dug is determined more by the price of coal than by some president saying, "Hey, open season." He can open federal lands to coal mining, but if the price is so low that it's not affordable to mine it, no one's going to mine it. So there are limits to what a president can do.
Great. Our second question is from Skylar Nelson. They want to know, are there concerns about a backlash towards the scientific and journalistic communities during a Trump administration?
Well, there's, as long as the Republicans hold the majorities in the Senate and the House, and the House Committee on Science was already going after some scientists under Lamar Smith, and so even without a president and a Republican president, the harassment potential has been there. Budget cuts are something that will be a real issue for agencies. My guess is the ones that will be cut most are the regulatory agencies. Here in New York State, years and years and years ago, George Pataki, I wrote a page one piece for the Times shortly after I got to this paper in '96 or so. Pataki had gained a very good green reputation as a Republican for land conservation in the Hudson Valley and for work on the New York City's water supply up there. But he got bad marks for sort of weakening the regulatory apparatus through budget cuts and that kind of thing. I would guess that's the way it's going to play out under Trump.
There's a question here from David W. Anderson. Which Trump will show up, the pro-clean energy Trump of 2009 or the anti-renewable energy Trump we've seen on Twitter?
Oh, gosh. In the writing I've done the last couple of days, I've given room for the greener Trump to emerge, like at least the possibility, but each cabinet appointment he's made so far has been not exactly at the center of things. So we'll kind of have to see. He has said things that I think were underplayed by or ignored by the media, and certainly weren't on social media because they're nuanced. that science matters. There was this again science debate. Those questions that science debate sent to the campaigns were really really important because, and he said something that was really interesting to me that he didn't have to say. I mean, he said innovation's important. That's great. I mean, what president is not going to say innovation is important? But Trump's statement said, though there are increasing demands to curtail spending and to balance the federal budget, we must make the commitment to invest in science, engineering, healthcare, and other areas that will make the lives of Americans better, safer, and more prosperous. So he actually included there that even with budget cuts, that's something he sees as a priority. Now, if he holds to that, that's kind of exciting. And way, way back when the Republican majority came in the House, this is the last time, 2010 or 12, I can't remember. George Will, the very conservative columnist, wrote a column warning them not to gut science. And he said at the time, science matters. Lincoln, the Republican, Abraham Lincoln created the National Academy of Sciences. So there's no reason to think the Republican can't embrace science. Trump has talked about NASA. He wants to boost NASA's space budget, space exploration budget. I'm not quite sure where he's at with that, but so he was worried that. But he has talked about trimming climate spending. But there too, when you look at his budget statements, they're kind of silly. It's just general statements. We'll have to see. I think we're just going to have to see one day at a time. And the media, and certainly here at ProPublica, we're paying close attention and letting us know what's going on.
That point of being ProPublica, are there specific areas that you are looking to dive into in 2017? What might we expect, without giving away too much, from you and ProPublica?
Well, one thing, when they announced this position, I assumed, and I said at the top of my pitch for how I would pursue the job, something like, I'm sure what you're going to read below is going to be pretty different than what you'll see from a lot of other candidates for a job at ProPublica, because it's not unusual to think, well, you go after Exxon or there's got to be a bad guy out there, and we'll unfrock the bad guy and the world will change. This is where, having written about climate change from virtually every point of view, every standpoint, every vantage point, and interrogated every question since 1988, I kind of have recognized the scope of this story is such that there is no simple bad guy. And usually when you find one, it turns out that it's a broader issue. In other words, think about oil companies. Well, who's buying the oil? Who's flying and who's living in an air-conditioned house? And in the Northeast, who's heating their home with oil, which I do in the Hudson Valley. And so it's harder to say, oh, you villains. And the wealth and industrial power we have in this past century all was built on fossil fuels. So I try to get back to basic principles. José Lutzenberger, the environment minister in Brazil in the 1980s, I met him down there when I was writing about the Amazon rainforest. He said the goal of environmentalism, and to me environmental journalism, should be to be radical. But he uses the Latin root of the word radical, which means to get to the root. Radical means the root. And to me, investigative pursuit of answers on climate change means getting into the root. Digging to the root means looking at everything from population growth in Africa, which is the prime driver of vulnerability to climate dangers, not global warming. That's part of the root and reality of this. And if someone is misconstruing or characterizing that as something else, then my job will be to make sure readers have a clear view, because it can change your priorities as a U.S. government or as individuals. Invest in, pay attention to your careers.
Here's a question from Kurt Newton. Regarding climate change, seems time to focus on states and big city mayors. Do you have any opinion on the next good local level prospect where support networks might be the greatest value and impact?
Well, this is a great issue, a great question. New York City is a good example. I'm not sure where that reader might be from, but there's a way to build a pretty broad constituency around the core questions, one of which is, how do we reduce our community's vulnerability to hazards that the climate system throws at us? So if you're in the Midwest and the tornado alley, your issue really isn't climate change. Your issue is, why are developers not building houses here with basements? Because you'll die when your house gets torn apart by the next tornado. And there's really no science pointing to global warming being part of that. But at the same time, in that area, and I've written about this, in the Midwest, even in areas that are really skeptical about global warming, there are libertarians who love solar and wind because it allows us to be beholden to some big utility. There was a guy interviewed last year by John Sutter at CNN out in Woodward County, Oklahoma, which is apparently the most skeptical county in America when it comes to global warming science. But this company kind of worker, executive guy, He says, yeah, we're going to cover our whole roof with solar. We want to get off the grid entirely. And his thinking has nothing to do with global warming. So in your community, talking to people around you about, how do we secure our energy system?
Kurt's from Boston, by the way.
Boston, okay.
Boston area, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're, culturally there's more uniformity perhaps. But you look at the vulnerabilities and you look at the energy opportunities in your community. And I think it's really important to figure out ways to share information. So if you have an old house, and you're doing a retrofit, and you're trying to figure out how to cut waste heat, and which is saving money and greenhouse gases, making sure this you build maybe a Facebook community group for your community to share tips on things. That's I think a great start. Where I live in the Hudson Valley, we have a Phillipstown Locals is a Facebook group where it's where I turn when there's something in the news or you hear an explosion or there's a helicopter nearby or whatever. As a community, you can build your own capacity to share ideas, and I think that's a great way to go.
You mentioned skepticism just a second ago, and here's a question from, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this poorly, Renuka Body. She says, "Hi Andrew, congratulations on your move. Was it motivated by the rise in climate skepticism?"
Oh, hold on. I don't want to listen to my own. I was trying to look at the questions. No, it's motivated by disconnects in understanding at every scale. I think many people who are worried about global warming and gravitated to the issue are not necessarily well informed about which solutions have traction, which ones are more surfacey. I was at Columbia Journalism School talking to business journalism students a few days ago, and I showed how Germany's gains with solar panels and stuff, which have made Germany have a really great reputation as a green country, haven't really blunted their use of fossil fuels at all. They still drive on the Autobahn at 160 miles an hour, and so oil is still a big chunk of their emissions, and they still mine a lot of coal. Germany has a lot of coal, and so it bugs me when people have this perception, well, Germany's doing it and the United States isn't. Part of my job is to not just to convince someone that global warming is real on one end, but it's to say which solutions are real and salient, have credibility and which don't. I think it's it's the whole mix. It's not just skepticism.
Here's an interesting question from Steve Austin. And maybe it's not just one side. Maybe that's the other side too. But what challenges do individual states face in the fight against climate change when the government is being run by Republicans?
Well, utility policies often are set at the state level. So, and I was just learning about this at a meeting the other day. FERC, there are federal. There is federal oversight over aspects of the grid, but a lot of decisions will end up being state-level decisions. Florida, you've probably heard in the news about Florida's issues with trying to make solar more available. Mm-hmm. It's the sunshine state should have a lot of access to solar, right? But there's industry-backed efforts that are kind of undermining that. That's state-level stuff that can make a real difference. Is the REV plan, our New York REV, renewing the energy vision or reviving, reviewing, rebooting. And so in New York State, they're trying to look at the regulations for the grid to try to make it easier to integrate renewable energy before too long. So there's a lot that can be done at the state level, even with federal, if federal rules go in the other direction. Now, if you're in a state that has a lot of fossil fuels and it's on federal land, BLM land, whatever, the states are kind of in the back seat there. And, federal regulations for, one of the things that Trump could get at if he wanted to, and hopefully he won't, is fuel mileage standards for cars. Obama has set those on a pretty aggressive trajectory, but that's rollbackable, and that's something that the states don't have control over. Although, and from what I understand, California, as it did with clean air standards, they can have their own standards also and California is such a big market that they can end up influencing how things go more generally. So it's a mix. Depends on where you are. It depends on, if voters are engaged. If you're engaged, that's probably better than not being.
There's this one question here um, from Christina Curran. Will environmental research funding, STAR grants, for example, be reduced?
Well, this gets back to this. In late October, Trump gave a speech where he said he's going to end all funding of anything related to climate. But it was like this broad brush thing. Joe Rahm at Climate Progress and BNA, the journalism enterprise, looked into that. There's most of what's there is renewable energy spending, technology spending, and deployment policies and stuff. So if that does get cut, that's a problem. My sense is once people dig in on that, they'll realize doesn't make a lot of sense, especially because there's widespread support among Republicans for renewable energy. In fact, I wrote it on .earth about when you look at maps of attitudes on renewable energy. There's no red and blue states. Like all this red-blue stuff goes away, and everybody says yes. Hopefully, once they dig in, they'll realize that, it's one thing to have these cartoonish statements on the stump for a politician. It's another to when you get into the driver's seat and actually start making policy. Especially, remember, the Republicans have to get the Congress, a big chunk of Congress is up for re-election in 2018. That campaign starts right now. And so those Republican candidates will be pressuring the administration not to be too extreme one way or the other.
Just a follow-up to that question. So there is environmental research. If it gets cut, what are the biggest casualties to that? Like what happens? What do we see? What are the tangible things that happen if that funding does get cut?
Well, sadly, some of these budgets have already been cut. Monitoring, stream gauges, simple things like stream gauges matter a lot if you want to understand how river floods happen and river flows. And I've written about this in the past, where we're really bad under Republican or Democratic administrations at sustaining funding for things like monitoring conditions, because it's not exciting, it's not new science. It's it's infrastructure. Basically, it's another form of infrastructure. And here, theoretically, Trump has made he has made many statements about reinvesting in infrastructure. If he understands the value of the infrastructure we use to monitor environmental conditions, which doesn't matter what you think about global warming or whatever, making sure we have a clear picture of environmental conditions, of change, of when extreme events happen, how they happen, and is vital. So, again, one can only hope. We'll see. Again, the next couple of months through this year, the picture will emerge of whether they'll recognize an opportunity there.
I guess, segueing to that, here's a question from Annette Lockwood about, issues or priorities that the new administration is going to take on. She says, what do you think will be the first issue addressed by this new administration?
It won't be anything related to the environment. It'll be his top drawer issues, immigration and everything else that he made his campaign on, jobs, which may include infrastructure spending. But it won't be. The first words out of his mouth aren't. Well, one of the things he has said, but won't be the first words out of his mouth, are drill, baby, drill. Right. Because oil prices are low and coal prices are through the floor too. So there's no industry just chomping at the bit there. It might have made sense in West Virginia to say you're going to defend coal, but so there's certain things that won't be on his list. Yeah.
I don't know if this question is too fatalist, but it comes from Marcia Webb. Is it not already too late? Are we not already past the point of no return?
Yeah, well, this is a question I've written about innumerable times in thinking about climate change. There's a lot of climate change already baked into the system. Seas, without some huge kind of geoengineering style intervention, sea levels will be rising for centuries to come already. And especially if the breakdown of a couple of the ice sheets in Antarctica. There was a couple of papers a couple of years ago that said that talked to the inevitable collapse of certain ice sheets. The thing there is that collapse they project will start in earnest 200 years from now and get into high gear between 200 and 900 years from now. So even though it's too late in that sense, it's not too late in the sense that it will affect our lives right now. It does mean that we have to understand I don't like using the word we, because there is no we. The people living in small islands in the Pacific Ocean are nothing to do with our experience of life. But it makes sense to start to think about policies that normalize that sea levels are not going to be normal anymore. There's no new normal sea level anymore going forward, and that hasn't happened through the last thousands of years of human history. Normalizing that means that urban planners, designers, architects, leaders have to figure out new ways of living on coasts, floating airports, whatever. And some of that's not always me. It just means that the things we thought were normal and the way life has been that we thought was normal won't be normal anymore. But that's also, remember, it's too late to go back from the internet. It's too late to go back to a lot of things. We're in a state where change is changing. The pace of change has led to new norms for how young people have to think about what skills they want to get into the job market. The Times is shrinking its budget for people, but the newsroom has 1,300 people in it still, and had 1,300 people in it 10 years ago. It's that they're different people. they're young. They're social media engagement journalists, or audience engagement people, or web designers, or graphic people, or programmers. So the environmental changes, including climate change, are just a subset of this. And this is all what I write about. It's called the Anthropocene, this age of us. Earth is, it's been a very uncomfortable learning process for humans to integrate that we've become a global scale force. A lot of those changes are irreversible. And it leads to this question that was my question for 9 years on .Earth, which is essentially what do we want to be when we grow up as a species? Right now we've been in like puberty. It's kind of like, wow, look what I can do. And it's like, oh shoot, look what I can do. And so that leads to some of the feelings that reader expressed, are hard. There's a grieving process there, but also there can be some excitement in thinking about new frontiers.
Here's one from Laura Edwards Treza. Do you think it would be possible to take the lead to gather an emergency summit of scientists and invite Trump to attend and review the actual evidence of climate change to possibly sway him to the reality of climate change?
Well, it might take time. I'm not so sure an emergency summit is the way to go. George W. Bush was skeptical. Very similar circumstances to right now, when it was an incredibly contested election, Clinton-Gore, and then Gore-Bush. And I was in the climate negotiations that right as that election was being determined in the Supreme Court. It was bizarre. And George Bush had expressed some environmental policies, including limiting CO2 in the campaign. And then he backslid and went back to saying he wasn't going to do that. Trump, in 2009, as someone who visited in an earlier question noted, in 2009 he signed a big letter, saying we need climate action. Chances of him going greener, with or without a big science conclave, are not high, but it's conceivable. He's been a shapeshifter for years, and we'll just have to see which shape he shifts into on January 20th.
We're at 2:30.
Yeah.
So there's a few other questions. We'll try to get to those. But anything you want to end on?
There's a call coming in for me shortly from someone to talk about nuclear energy under Trump, like momentarily, so that might have to pause. But
okay.
I'll try to. I can look at the questions
Yeah.
and answer them also in text. So keep the questions coming, I guess is one thing I would say. Even though I'm not going to be blogging at .earth anymore, that doesn't mean I go behind a veil. And I'll be using Facebook increasingly, actually, as my platform to connect with the public and with other with experts as well. So always ask questions here. And I'm easy to find on Twitter at Revkin, ProPublica.org or at ProPublica, and just